Hey class, it's me again. It's Philosophy 101, week 4. So this week we're still in the classical period of Greek philosophy, and we're going to talk a little bit about the background on Aristotle. I'm going to spend a little bit of time exploring some of Aristotle's insights on systematic logic, because we learn a lot about Aristotle from his ideas on logic. Your readings this week cover both virtue theory and mostly virtue theory, a little bit on aesthetics, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Aristotle's metaphysics and epistemology. So, first things to note is that at the age of 18, Aristotle was sent to Athens. His parents had passed away when he was younger, and he became from Macedonia, and he became the student of Plato in the academy. So he's probably Plato's most famous student. Interestingly enough, he disagreed with Plato's theory of forms. He did not succeed Plato. He is also famous for being the tutor of Alexander the Great, and he started tutoring Alexander the Great when Alexander was about 13 years old. Of course, Alexander the Great is the Greek ruler who is noted for actually moving the empire east through to the Middle East, through also eventually reaching India. So, after Plato died, and it was clear he wasn't succeeding Plato, Aristotle created his own school, which is called the Lyceum. So he was still very much in favor, but after Alexander the Great died, so he outlived his pupil. That's interesting. And after the death of Alexander the Great, Aristotle fled Athens on charges to avoid charges of impiety. He did not want to be a second Socrates. So he lived out his remaining years on a remote island. And he still continued to do interesting scientific work there. So I'm going to start with logic. So from Aristotle, we get a full range of philosophical exploration. So the key idea that we learn from Aristotle is he created this idea about a syllogism, which is a two-premise deductive argument. So it's a deductive argument, and it's deductive because of the way it's constructed, not necessarily because of the content. And the two premises lead to the conclusion. So, according to Aristotle, there are some rules to follow. At least one premise has to be universal. At least one premise has to be affirmative. And if one of the premises is negative, the conclusion is negative. So, in the example that I've given here, no dogs are birds. Parrots are birds, therefore no dogs are parrots. So I want you to see it follows the rules. One of the premises is a universal, the first premise. At least one premise has to be affirmative. So you can have two negative premises. And if one of the premises is negative, the conclusion is negative. So these rules, it may sound kind of odd, but these rules actually help us identify when we're going off the rails. So I'm going to give you some more rules. Don't worry if you don't get this right away. It's something to continue to come back to and kind of play around with. But honestly, it's a very helpful tool. So if you can get it, that's great. So three rules of all valid thoughts. And remember, when we're talking about validity, we're only talking about deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning by definition, cannot be deemed to be valid or invalid, only strong or weak arguments. So we're just talking about deductive logic here. So the first thing is the law of identity. A tree does not have another identity other than being a tree. There's also the law of non-contradiction. A statement can never be true and false at the same time. So, according to Aristotelian logic, you can't have a paradoxical statement. And also there's the law of the excluded middle. A statement can be either true or false. There's no middle ground. So these are kind of two sides of the same coin here. Okay. Now, in symbolic logic and Aristotelian logic, oftentimes letters represent ideas. So I'm going to use the representational forms here, and then I'm going to give you an example using words. So all x's are y's, all y's are z's, all x's are z's is a valid syllogism form. All x's are y's, no y's are z's, no x's are z's. So notice these all follow all three of the rules from before. You can see one premise is universal, one premise is affirmative, and if one of the premises is negative, the conclusion is negative, right? But we won't run into a problem because let's look at the next one. These are invalid syllogism forms. So there's something that is not happening here. So all x's are y's, all z's are y's, all x's are z's. So there's something you can see, it appears to be a sort of chain argument, but it's not. So be careful about this. And you can see the same formulation below is also another invalid syllogism. Okay, so let's look. I have two examples for you. So the question is, which one of these is valid? In example A, the first premise is, all people who love dogs are nice people. No nice people kick dogs. Therefore, no people who love dogs kick dogs. Now let's look at the second example. All people who love dogs are nice people. All nice people are people who feed dogs treats. All people who love dogs are people who feed dogs treats. Who feed dogs treats, I should have said. So, let's back up here, see if you can recognize the form, all right? So, again, you want to look and see which format is being followed here. Is A a valid syllogism or an invalid syllogism? Is B a valid syllogism or an invalid syllogism? So I want you to notice that A is a valid syllogism because it follows all x's are y's, no y's are z's, no x's are z's. Let's look at this. So X is all people who love dogs are nice people. Why? No Y are Z. Therefore, no X are Z. So do you see this? I'm going to go back. No X's are Z's. So A follows this valid format. Now, another very similar, it sounds like a similar argument, but what I want you to notice here is it follows an invalid format. So in this invalid format, it's all people who love dogs, let's call that statement X, are nice people, Y. Then the second one is all nice people are people who feed dogs treats. So that's X, Y, X, Z. All people who love dogs, so that's X again, are people who feed dogs treats. So notice that is actually this example here. All X's are Y's, all Z's are Y's, all X's are Z's. And this is actually an invalid syllogism. You can look at this again. Oops. Okay. So again, deductive reasoning, deductive logic can be proven to be valid or invalid. So, and notice the whole point is that a valid syllogism is the truth of the premises must lead to the truth of the conclusion. But notice here, if it's true that all people who love dogs are nice people, okay, let's say that's true. And we say all nice people are people who feed dogs treats. We actually can't say all people who love dogs are people who feed dogs treats. You might think it sounds right, but it's not valid. So here's a picture I took a few summers ago in England of Hadrian's Wall. So in the 2nd century, the Roman Emperor Hadrian created a wall to keep out the barbarians from the north. Now the dividing line, it's about 80 miles long across the UK, and on either side is England. A little bit further north of the wall is Scotland. But the Romans were trying to keep out the barbarians. Ultimately, it didn't really work. So, but it's still in existence. Now it's a tourist destination. And the very interesting thing is the wall, which here is maybe about 6 or 7 feet tall, is there's sheep on either side. So could you create an argument about this image and the story that I've told you? Just an open-ended question. Okay, so the readings that you have this week, I think that, and if you haven't already picked your topic for your paper, I do recommend the selection from Aristotle on virtue ethics, because it's really straightforward. And according to Aristotle, the distinguishing characteristic of man or humanity is our ability to reason. And he believes that happiness is an activity that is in accordance with virtue. I think both other videos on Aristotle's virtue ethics are very straightforward, so I won't go into those anymore. But Aristotle, in his article, distinguishes between 2 types of virtue. The first type of virtue is intellectual virtue, which includes philosophical wisdom and practical wisdom, and moral virtue, which is, he says, developed by habit. And he says that the character of humanity is developed through habit according to the doctrine of the mean. So in this case, mean refers to the average or the middle path between deficiency and excess. So for example, the example of courage is the middle point between cowardice and excess, or cowardice and, let's say, brashness. So you can think of other virtuous characteristics like kindness or piety or truthfulness, and how they are, in their best possible sense, according to Aristotle, they are the midpoint between two extremes. But the really interesting idea that Aristotle is proposing is that human beings develop virtue. They're not born bad or born good. They develop virtue through habit. And it is that development, the development of virtue, that brings happiness or fulfillment to life, not just blindly eating whatever you want and doing whatever you want, but happiness, in essence, he equates to living a virtuous life. So what do you think about that? Could be an interesting topic. The other idea that is interesting, one of Aristotle's famous works called De Anima, which is of the soul or of the psyche. And Aristotle believed that human beings have three souls, a tripartite soul. The vegetative soul, in fact, this book, the De Anima, is probably the first psychology textbook. And the vegetative soul is the source of nourishment and reproduction. So that's that urge to feed and reproduce. The second part of the human soul is, he calls the animal soul. So it's shared with all species. And the animal soul gives human beings the ability to experience pleasure and pain or avoid pleasure and pain. But he says that human beings have a third soul, and this is what really distinguishes them from other beings, other living beings. And that spiritual or intelligent soul he calls the nous. And it is pure and immortal and helps give rise to the human interest in ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. So in fact, the whole reason that we do philosophy, or there's this history of people seeking to understand the nature of reality, how people know, and how people should live, is because they have this spiritual, intelligent soul aspect to them. So even though Aristotle was very much one of our first scientists, he also believed that humanity and human beings have a soul. Okay. So if you go back to last week and look at what we discovered about Plato's ideas about the theory of forms, it's important to know that for Aristotle, this is where he really parted ways with Plato. So in Plato's conception of reality, we know through our reason and our intellect. And we're deceived by our senses. So we can't trust our senses. But according to Aristotle, we can know things through our senses. And Aristotle thought that Plato's theory of the forms didn't make sense if you looked at it, the more you looked at it. Because, of course, the theory of the forms is that for everything that exists on the planet, which is really just perhaps an image or an idea of a concept, that somewhere out there is a form of that thing that is beyond reality. And that's where, and so Aristotle began to ask, well, okay, let's say you have a ball and you have a plate. Both of them could have, maybe there's a form of ballness, a round sphere that bounces. So there's a form of ballness, and there's a form of plateness. So there's a form of a circular thing that is people eat off of. But it could also be said that the ball and the plate both share a third third form of circularity. So he said the more you look at different entities and objects and constructs, you end up creating what he called this third man argument, which makes the theory of forms a little ridiculous. So the way out of the theory of forms for Aristotle was by talking about two different categories. The larger category he called universals, and the smaller category are the individual expressions he called particulars. So for example, all of us in this class, me as a teacher, you as students, we are all particular human beings, but we are of the category of universality, a universal of man or humanity. So for Aristotle, because we can know through our senses as well as our ideas, that everything we do to observe a thing and think about a thing comes together. And it comes together in this very tidy idea that Aristotle has. It's not in your reading, I'm just bringing it up to you. It's called the four-cause theory of Aristotle. So according to Aristotle, you could examine and investigate and understand every thing, person, object, being through this four-cause theory. So again, notice this has an implied metaphysics and epistemology here. That's what I want you to get at. So the formal cause is what is this thing that we're talking about? What is the form of the thing? The material cause is what is this thing made out of? The third or efficient cause is what or who made the thing, or how did the thing come into being? And the fourth and final cause, which he might call the most important, is what purpose does this thing serve? That is, for what end was it made? So I thought we could test this on an image of a water bottle. There's a water bottle. So the formal is, what is the form of this? It's, a cylindrical object with a lid that holds in liquid. Okay? That's the formal cause to help us understand. The material, it's probably made of plastic, right? The way it looks there, it looks like it's probably made of plastic, not of metal. Efficient causes, how did it come to be? Well, it came to be because somebody made it probably in a factory, right? So this water bottle was conceived of by some design person and then constructed in a factory. But the biggest question is, what is the final cause of the water bottle? What purpose does it serve? That people want to carry water around with them. So, and they want a lid so they won't spill it, right? But why are they carrying, why do they want to have something that carries water without spilling? So the more you investigate, the more you discover what something is. So he created basically a method of investigating objects in a very systematic way to get you to look at what is the nature of the thing and how do we know the nature of the thing. So I hope you found this interesting, and I look forward to reading your papers.